Stories, they have a special place in the human species. It's part of the way we point to higher truths. And I think that's just as true now as it was in ancient times. And there's one particular story that was written about 80 years ago that I think all of us here should still know pretty well. If I said to you, faster than a speeding bullet, faster than a locomotive, able to leap a tall building in a single bound, look up at the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman! Right? Superman was first written in 1939. My grandparents knew who Superman was, and I think it's pretty safe to say that my grandchildren are going to know who Superman was, right? It's a story that just speaks to us, right? So Superman, he's an alien from another planet, he's crash landed on Earth, he looks just like any other human being, but he's got superpowers, and he could rule the world if he wants to. But he doesn't. Instead, he lives a humble life as mild-mannered Clark Kent. He's got those glasses on and no one can recognize him. It's like the perfect disguise, right? And, you know, he goes around and instead of using his powers to rule over people and to oppress people, he uses his powers to protect the innocent, right? And he's a humble guy. He doesn't like violence. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. He just wants to live a decent life and protect those who are in need. Well, you know, around the world, Superman is actually considered to be a very American story, you know, and that not just Superman, but the whole genre of superheroes, Batman, Spider-Man, all of that is considered to be very, very American. And that gives me hope, because if Americans can love Superman, then Americans can love socialism. Bear with me, that might sound like a shock. I told you Superman was first written by two comic book writers in Cleveland in 1939. Well, one of Superman's first actions was to save a group of striking miners, right? These miners were on strike, their crooked boss was looking to go after them, so Superman flies in and rescues them. And those early Superman comics are full of statements against racism and condemning racism and bigotry. Now, today that might sound like just some lame liberal, you know, we hear that everywhere. Back in 1939, when Jim Crow segregation was still in effect and lynchings were taking place, the fact that this nationally syndicated comic book was denouncing racism was a very big deal. And don't forget that during the Second World War, in the radio version of Superman, Superman actually fought the Ku Klux Klan, right? They called them the Knights of the Fiery Cross, and he fought against the Klan. Why? Well, the Second World War was going on, and fascism was the enemy, and the Soviet Union was the ally. And these Klansmen, they were admiring Hitler, and they were preaching racism, and they were dividing the country and helping the enemy. So Superman went into battle to fight the Klansmen. You know, Superman, and you know, wow, the next point I want to make, this is a good one. Who's Lex Luthor? Who's Lex Luthor? So he's a bald guy, a maniacally evil bald guy. He's using technology, but he's not using technology to make a better life for the people. He's using technology so he can rip people off and hurt the community and make super profits at the expense of everyone else. So basically, Lex Luthor is Jeff Bezos. And whenever Lex Luthor Bezos has another evil plot against the people, what does Superman do? He runs into the nearest phone booth, he changes his costume real fast, and he flies in to rescue the people. And who are the people? It's the working class. Those of us who just want to survive. Those of us who just want a decent life. Does anyone here know how you say the phrase man of steel in Russian? Yeah, and that wasn't an accident. At the time those comics were published, in 1939, the Communist Party of the United States had tens of thousands of members. And among the unemployment councils and the labor unions and the anti-fascist associations that they led, they had influence over millions of people. In fact, not far from here, just a few blocks up, begins the district that Vito Marcantonio represented in the U.S. Congress. Vito Marcantonio was a friend of the Communist Party, a member of the International Workers' Order. He represented New York City, Harlem, in the U.S. Congress. At that point, you know, a lot of amazing people were associated with the Communist Party. Paul Robeson, a very famous singer. Langston Hughes. In fact, Langston Hughes, the famous African-American poet, for the 1939 convention, or 1932 convention of the Communist Party, he actually wrote a poem, and it went like this. He said, "Put one more S in the USA, let's make it Soviet. Put one more S in the USA, oh, we can win it yet. Once the land belongs to the farmers and the factories to working men, the USA, when we take control, will be the USSA then." That was Langston Hughes. And that was 1932. And back at that point, early in the 1930s, the communists were always talking about Soviet America. They had a book toward Soviet America. But interestingly, the leaders of the Soviet Union told them to stop doing that. They said Soviet's a Russian word. It's not an English word. And if you ever have socialism in the USA, you're not going to copy our system. You're going to do it your own way. It's going to be an American form of socialism. So the Soviets didn't like that. Now, sometimes the most educational events that you can go to are funerals, right? And I consider it a great privilege that when I was an activist 10 years or so ago in Cleveland, that I got to know some older communists. And there was one older woman who was about this tall that used to go to peace rallies with us. And she was mid-80s at the time that I knew her. And I actually then got to go to her funeral when she passed away, and I got to learn her whole life story. She had immigrated to the country from Lebanon when she was like 4 years old. She lived on the west side of Cleveland, and her father lost his job, and they were actually kicked out of their home. But then she remembers very vividly, one of her most vivid memories of childhood was when in 1935, when Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration and hired millions of unemployed people and gave them jobs, how they got their home back, the very home they'd been evicted from, they got back into their home. And I remember riding in the car with her to a peace rally and her explaining me and telling me this story about how Roosevelt had gotten them their home back. But then I pressed her a little bit and she said, well, it wasn't just Roosevelt. It was a mass movement of people behind him. And that's why she eventually joined the Communist Party, because there was no other organization in Cleveland on the west side in the late 1930s that did more to fight for unemployment, to fight for the rights of working class people, to oppose racism and bigotry, to stand with Roosevelt. No other organization did that stronger than the Communist Party. And it was, it was just a touching story that she had to tell. And also, at that point in world history, to admire the Soviet Union wasn't a hard thing to do, because at that point we were having the Great Depression in the United States. People were literally starving to death and hungry. But the Soviet Union had gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to, in 1936, they had electrified the entire country. They brought running water to the entire country. They put so much, they wiped out illiteracy. They'd done so much. It's this crazy thing. It's like a cliche. People say things without thinking about them, right? They repeat the same phrases over and over. This whole thing about socialism failed. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? Socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. The next time somebody says that to you, just say Sputnik, right? Who was the first country in outer space? The next time somebody says that to you, say AK-47 rifle, the most efficient rifle in history. Next time someone says that, say Tetris, right? It's the weirdest thing. You get people saying, well, in socialism, no one ever produces anything. The Soviet Union produced more steel than any other country in the world. And today, half of the steel on Earth is produced in the state-controlled steel industry of China. So this idea that socialism just doesn't produce anything is absurd. Why is it that all over the world, people know about Cuba, a very, very small island? That's because of the medical volunteers that they send all over the world. In fact, people all over the world are studying their achievements. But no one acknowledges this, right? Even some of the voices defending socialism, well, they just won't go there. It's one of the most absurd things.